They called it Graffiti Highway, and it used to lead to a ghost town. It all started in 1962, when an accidental fire at the town's landfill ignited an underground coal seam. Today, toxic steam wafts up through the ground. In some places, the vents are so hot, you can cook eggs. As a producer for Business Insider, I've worked on dozens of stories like this, about the messes that people create that are nearly impossible to clean up. What always surprises me is that even in the most polluted places, we meet remarkable people doing whatever they can just to make it through another day. Here are the stories of how people get by in 15 of the world's most toxic places. Every round in this rifle could save a bird's life. The splash of the bullet scares migrating species off this mile-long toxic lake in Montana. If birds land there for more than a few hours, the acidic water cooks them from the inside out. It's Mark Mariano's mission to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yep, Mark Mariano, Waterfowl Protection Specialist. We invented that title, but it fits.
He uses a multi-million-dollar arsenal of high-tech tools to keep birds off of what used to be a copper mine in Butte, Montana.
This is the one everybody likes to see, though. Do you get to fly the drone? That's what they always say. No.
What's now a toxic bird bath started out as an open pit mine 65 years ago. But in 1982, the company that owned the mine shut down the water pumps. Groundwater started to seep in, creating sulfuric acid that leached metals out of the rock. People have been shooing birds off the Berkeley pit ever since. And some of the methods they've developed here could help protect the estimated hundreds of millions of birds killed by industrial activity every year. Snow geese, avocets, and grebes are just a few of the species that stop in Butte on their journey north in spring and south in fall. And Mark loves them all.
And your widgeon, teal. I mean, I dream, sleep, eat, and poop, ducks. We obviously went over the top with the wildlife decor. My mom bought me this one and I told her it was stupid, and now I love it.
But the sounds that repel birds are more unnatural.
So we're gonna move it over. There it goes. Always when you're trying to talk.
The first line of defense is 4 so-called wailers. They randomly play a series of alarms to annoy the birds.
You can hear these things on a nice warm summer night all across Butte.
And propane cannons hooked up to timers fire all day.
They mimic gunfire, which a lot of the birds are scared of for obvious reasons.
On special occasions, the birds might get their own private fireworks display.
This is a kind of a last resort, or we know, something big would be coming. We've used them twice.
One of Mark's favorite tools is meant for spotting the birds before they get wet.
It's a $5,000 Swarovski scope.
But after nearly 4 years on the job, he can usually spot them with the naked eye.
Can you see them?
No.
I'm going to keep laying on them, because if we can keep them from landing, that's always the best.
HQ is this small hut, along the same ridge where the mine's dispatcher used to direct trucks. They call it the Bird Shack.
We've discussed renaming it something more professional sounding than Bird Shack, but it's become such kind of a colloquial term that we kept it.
During peak season, someone like Mark comes up here every hour to do what they call hazing. That's the technical term for annoying birds that land on the pit, so they fly away.
We got a group coming in.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
And it looks like more shovers.
So there's 33.
2, 3, 43.
When they first started scaring off birds 30 years ago, their only tools were a rifle and a clipboard. They didn't even have heat during the long Montana winters. For the most part, it worked. Even if the miners' records looked like a real-life game of duck, duck, goose. That changed in 2016. Snow geese migrate through Montana every year, but that November, an estimated 60,000 of them landed on the pit.
Essentially, the entire snow goose population of our flyway came overnight, hit a nasty storm, and ended up using the worst rest stop that they possibly could. This could be myth now, but they shot the gun so many times the barrel essentially curved because it got too hot.
About 3,000 birds died in a matter of days, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Those guys choke up when they, a burly miner talking about coming out here and seeing, thousands of snow geese on there.
After that, the companies working to clean up the pit brought in experts to devise a more scientific approach. The researchers discovered that the pit attracts over 50 bird species, not just ducks and geese. The companies invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into fancy high-tech tools, but many didn't work. It turns out that each kind of bird responds differently.
With each of the technologies, as well as the simple stuff, a combo of them can help sometimes. And then usually one will pick up where the other leaves off.
The aerial drone is most effective when birds land on ice or the shore, where there's a risk a bullet could ricochet. Mark's high-powered laser works well on American coots and other species that like to migrate at night. In 2016, they custom-built drones just for the pit. Early prototypes combined 3D printed parts with boogie boards and kid-sized kayaks.
So they're at your 10 o'clock.
Today, technicians use a remote control to operate what they call the water dog.
Here's the group. Oh, they probably went out of your view to the left a little bit now.
Sometimes the boat gets the birds to lift off. Then a rifle shot gets them to fly away. This new and improved suite of tools has a near-perfect record of keeping birds off this deadly human-made mess. Successful programs like the one at the pit are more important than ever. Nearly a third of North America's bird population has disappeared since 1970. Mining is to blame for destroying habitat, but some cleanup efforts have worked, just not always in the way people expect. For a prime example of that, you need to travel about 20 miles downstream. Every year, hundreds of thousands of birds stop here, the Warm Springs Wildlife Management Area. It's where researchers Stella Kaposha and Gary Swant come to count birds.
Oh, we've got some American absets.
These scientists helped design the pit's upgraded protection program.
The reports that we do here on Mondays and Wednesdays are posted in the bird shack, so these miners have a good predictive instrument of what might be in the pit. So here's a cinnamon teal that you probably haven't seen one of those yet this year.
During peak season, Gary's grandson also helps with the count.
We'll usually peak at like 50,000, 60,000 birds in the valley, and those are long days. Those are like 10-hour days.
The team comes to Warm Springs because it's a biodiverse haven that has hosted more than half of Montana's bird species. But just like the Berkeley Pit, it was created by humans.
This is a constructed area that now has then turned into a preserve for the wildlife.
In 1908, a flood washed mining waste from Butte into local waterways. It killed fish and made the water unsafe for humans. After that catastrophe, these ponds were built so that hard metals could seep out of the water before they run downstream. Giant hoppers neutralize the water with lime. That keeps things clean and safe enough for wildlife.
So the event happened in a single month in 1908, and here we are still getting it cleaned up. Feels wonderful because we can correct the problems of the past.
experts caution that it's impossible to erase over 100 years of mining pollution. But with people like Gary, Stella, and Mark on the job, the future for Montana's birds might be looking up. But not if you're a wild turkey.
I am by no means a seasoned turkey hunter, so this is my very first. But we saved everything.
Mark takes pride in not letting anything go to waste.
I made it real traditional, like a chicken noodle soup. It's even gluten-free, if you can believe that.
Has anyone ever pointed out to you the irony of the fact that your entire job is to keep wild birds safe and you go hunting?
I'm a big waterfowl hunter as well, and what that has taught me about protecting the waterfowl at the pit is just priceless. I wake up without an alarm every morning, and I'm, happy to go, literally rescue birds. And most days you walk home, with your head held high.
While more people than ever before have access to digital devices, it comes at a cost. E-waste is one of the fastest growing waste streams in the world, with around 62 million tons produced in 2022 alone. Nowhere is this more apparent than in neighborhoods like Seelampur in Delhi, India, where around 50,000 people scavenge through old electronics each day, cutting their hands and wearing away their fingerprints in the process.
India has become the world's biggest dumping ground for electronic waste. And much of it is processed and recycled manually, often by underage children.
ऐसे खोलते हैं ना इसको तो ये लग जाता है और ये पत्ता जो है इसका ये सब लग जाता है हाथों में कभी कदार.
E-waste is full of toxic chemicals like lead, arsenic, and mercury. But there are also plenty of valuable materials like copper, platinum, and even gold. So why does so much of it end up in landfills? And why is recycling it such a risky business? "14-year-old Gulzar starts his morning selling breakfast at his father's food cart. And after school, he heads to this dump to sort through e-waste.
इस काम में थोड़ा बहुत तो रिस्क है लेकिन करना पड़ता है मजबूरी में.
Most of India's electronic waste ends up in northeast Delhi's Seelampur neighborhood. Nearly 50,000 people dig through the trash here every day. Many of them are teenagers, all searching for old cell phones, computers, and video game controllers. Gulzar's hands are so damaged from years of prying them apart that his fingerprints have worn away.
जब मैंने पत्ता तोड़ना स्टार्ट करा था तब हाथ कटने लगे थे ना यहाँ पे तो मोबाइल जब फिंगरप्रिंट लगाता था चलता नहीं था मोबाइल खुलता नहीं था जल्दी.
Few have gloves or other safety equipment. The health risks are one of the reasons why Gulzar hasn't told his mother he still works here.
मम्मी कहती है काम मत करो पढ़ाई कर लो और नौकरी मिल जाएगी तुम्हें बढ़िया वाली.
Most of his friends also scavenge for a living, like Aleem, who stopped going to school because his father got tuberculosis 3 years ago. That's why his family sent him to work, even though he was just 16. Now, Aleem breaks down up to 150 of these phones every day.
ये होता है एक पत्ता मोबाइल का पत्ता जो इससे ऐसे अलग करना पड़ता है. ये होती बॉडी, ये होता पत्ता.
Old electronics have high levels of mercury, cadmium, and lead, which can harm the kidneys. But they also hold precious metals. Usually, Aleem can collect up to 11 pounds of mixed scrap, which he sells for $6 a day to a middleman at Ghaffar Market. It's famous for cheap electronics, and many e-waste devices are refurbished and sold here. Processing e-waste is complicated and expensive even in facilities that have more structure and modern machinery.
They're not designed to be recycled. Many different chemical compounds all smashed together. When devices got smaller and smaller, removing whole components became less and less possible.
We visited one of the largest recyclers in the US back in 2021. At the time, Sims Lifecycle Services was processing up to 6 million pounds of electronics a month. Most of these old devices come from private companies like HP that ship it here. A chunk of the work is done by hand. Memory units, processors, screens, keyboards, and motherboards can all be reused. Workers clean them, check if they're working, and send them back into inventory to be sold again.
Sometimes when you can't sell a whole laptop, we can remove parts from it and either rebuild a laptop to sell or sell the parts.
Big hard drives pulled from computers or servers are another moneymaker. Any stored data has to be wiped before a drive can be resold.
We have a lot of banks and insurance companies as our clients, so you can well imagine that those folks want their data erased properly.
What couldn't be refurbished used to be sent to recycling. Workers would remove hazardous materials like batteries before sending the device to a shredder. Metals, circuit boards, and plastic were separated in that process and resold. But since we filmed with them, recycling has become their last resort, only to prevent materials from going to landfills. They're more focused on refurbishing devices to extend their lifespan. China, the US, and India are the biggest generators of e-waste. But only 17% of electronics discarded globally were recycled in 2019. Much of it is illegally shipped to developing countries, where it's sorted by informal workers. But they don't have the knowledge or the tools to safely handle it. So a lot of it ends up in landfills. Sustainability expert Panni Verma says that's contaminating the environment.
Air, water, soil, all three of them are getting badly affected.
Sometimes they burn the waste that they cannot resell.
This is going into the nostrils. It's leading to stunted growth in children. It's leading to miscarriages in women. It's leading to organ damage. It's leading to bone density loss.
And most electronics are coated in flame retardants that release poisonous gases when burned.
It's also affecting the human body. Skin diseases, different types of cancers, they are happening because of the contaminations.
The waste has also polluted water sources like the nearby Yamuna River.
They acid wash the motherboards to take out the metals, the precious metals, and then they just drain it into any kind of a water body.
With global e-waste expected to increase 38% by the end of the decade, India implemented new rules to regulate recycling facilities. But they don't impact informal workers. Nor do they address child labor in the industry. Children as young as 14 are allowed to work in India, but not in hazardous conditions like these.
It kind of has become a work of generations, one generation to next, to next, to next. There has to be talks of these young children working to go study.
But going to school is not an option for Aleem. His mother, Gulshan Bano, sells vegetables to get by.
जो मैं कमाती हूँ वो किराया चला जाता है जो लड़का कमाता घर में खर्चा उठ जाता है वो भी कभी पूरा होता कभी नहीं होता
Aleem's friend Gulzar still goes to school.
पढ़ने में साइंस की किताब बहुत बढ़िया लगती है
And he has dreams of a better life.
बड़े हो करके बन जाऊंगा पुलिस ऑफिसर ही
A 100-year-old coal mine in Corning, Ohio, is still polluting the surrounding area with iron oxide. But it turns out that this toxic sludge is actually a valuable asset. Artists harvest this orange-colored sludge and turn it into paintings that help raise awareness about the region's toxic legacy. After a coal mine shuts down, the pollution doesn't stop. Toxic waste flows for decades, contaminating rivers and killing aquatic life. And it's nearly impossible to contain.
Yep. For a long time, most of these streams were just written off.
Now, a team has developed a method to harvest the muck and turn it into paint. But can it really clean up a century of worldwide waste? It's harvest day at Pine Run, a creek in Ohio.
Yeah, keep going. Moving now. Yeah, I see the flow.
Michelle Shively McIver and John Sabraw have been making pigment out of this pollution for over a decade.
This stuff is just really good.
Yeah, it's our favorite.
It is our favorite.
Their team built a system of pipes that collect smelly goo called acid mine drainage, or AMD for short. It's highly acidic water leaking from an old coal mine that closed over 100 years ago.
When you leave a mine and you just walk away from it, what happens is it fills up instantly with water.
There really is no way to seal the mines completely.
The water that still leaks from mines today creates iron oxide, which can be lethal to aquatic life.
That pipe is full of iron sludge, and it's going to come out of there really fast.
But it also happens to be an essential ingredient to make paint.
Yep. Buckets!
We need buckets! It's a low-tech system right now.
That's what this team is harvesting today.
It's gold, Matt. It's gold!
The team filters buckets of iron oxide using these troughs.
Smooth it out and put some Cool Whip on there, and it's like pumpkin pie in a bin. I'd eat it.
Today's haul is over 200 pounds of iron oxide. It's a bit more than this mine site pumps out in a single day. Wow. Then they move it to their research facility, where engineers wash the pigment to remove impurities that affect the final color.
Basically, we're just diluting out all the dissolved solids.
This is Guy Riefler. He's an engineer who partnered with Michelle and John to start True Pigments.
It still kind of shocks me that Sunday Creek is this orange mass, and it goes right through several communities, and it's been doing it for 20 years, and aside from us, nobody's really doing anything about it.
The team dries the pigment before shipping it off to a giant kiln. They change the color by controlling the temperature. Then they send the pigment to Portland, Oregon, where Gamblin Artists Colors uses it to make paint.
We wanted to be the first to make color with it. We were just kind of all in. There's 3 colors that are all made from pigment that has been painstakingly reclaimed by John and team.
This one is called Iron Violet. This worker mixes the pigment, zinc, and flax oil. And a mill uses heat and pressure to combine the pigment and oil.
And so with a little bit of pressure, we draw it down.
Then workers test for thickness, texture, and color. Finally, they bottle it up. Gamblin markets the paint as reclaimed earth colors. John teaches art and uses the paints in his own studio.
If I want something deep and red and earthy, you're not going to get anything better than an iron oxide.
He says his art helps to start conversations about protecting the environment.
The circle gives them permission to decide for themselves instantly whether that is a universe, a planet, a stream, or microbes.
And the new colors are taking off. painters across the country have shared what they've created using the hashtag #ReclaimedColor. For now, True Pigments can't harvest enough iron oxide to clean up an entire stream.
It has such a satisfying plop.
But the company plans to scale up. By 2024, True Pigments plans to open a larger facility. It will harvest iron oxide and clean the water at one of Ohio's most polluted acid mine sites. That would mean the company could harvest raw material that could be used in all kinds of products, not just paints.
Construction materials, concrete, bricks. It's used for a lot of industrial coatings, agricultural fertilizer, cosmetics. We really had to find something useful to make out of this really, detrimental pollution.
And Michelle says her team's method of retrieving iron oxide is more sustainable than mining it. Unfortunately, they're dealing with a nearly unlimited resource. There are nearly 10,000 square miles of abandoned coal mines across the United States.
Iron oxide didn't do anything wrong. Iron oxide is not to blame here. If you treat it right, like we're doing, it is a valuable asset. It is beautiful.
These mines will continue producing AMD for hundreds of years.
But Michelle is confident that turning pollution into art can make a difference. There are an estimated 500,000 abandoned coal mines in the United States, like this one in Ashford, West Virginia. While there is the more obvious risk of physical injury at the sites, the mines are also releasing heavy metals and toxins into the water and air.
Coal mining has ruined millions of acres of land across the U.S., and it can pollute the surrounding areas for decades after the coal is gone. Now, these farmers are restoring coal mining land with lavender. Can this farm be a model for lands destroyed by coal mining across the country? We went to Ashford, West Virginia to find out.
When I signed up, I found out it was a lavender farm. I was like, ain't no way. I never heard of a lavender farm. I kind of like it. It's my new home.
Aaron Morgan worked as a coal miner for a decade.
I'm not the only ex-miner here. There's a lot of ex-coal miners here.
He never imagined he would be picking flowers on coal mining land.
It's strange to me that it's been farmed now. Yeah, because it's really just all rock. It's a wasteland, really.
Appalachian Botanical Company, or ABCO, is on a retired part of a larger coal mine.
Let's go over and meet some of the guys.
My name's Frank. I've had an assortment of jobs. I like this one the best.
I don't even work here. I just come to bed.
We do turn a good section of this mountain purple during the blooming season.
The business is part of a reclaiming process that rebuilds the landscape with new vegetation. But it's complicated and costly. Imagine blasting the top off of a mountain and then trying to rebuild it piece by piece. Growing plants in the soil on mines is tough, but luckily,
lavender loves poor soils.
And the sweet-smelling herb can actually reduce toxic heavy metals in the soil.
We make sure the soil tests come back so that there's no heavy metals, no toxins of any kind.
The team harvests the lavender throughout the summer and early fall. ABCO uses every part of the flower, so nothing goes to waste.
I need like 35 pounds of these buds cut off by tomorrow.
They spread the lavender on the floor to cut the buds and bundle the stems to sell for cooking.
We strip the bottom 2 leaves off and we'll dip that in water and rooting hormone.
They save small leaf clippings and plant them to grow more lavender.
This is the 40-gallon pot. That's a 26-gallon.
Matt Carter boils water to steam distill about 40 pounds of lavender to make essential oil.
Everybody knows that oil is lighter than water. The oil floats to the top. Just drain the water off of it, which we keep the water too.
They filter the oil 3 times before bottling it up. They also use the flowers to make creams, honey, salt, and hand sanitizer.
Ready.
Finally, the leftover plant biomass is transformed into compost. coal companies are legally required to restore the land they have mined. After a company drills and blasts a deep pit, it piles all the broken rock and topsoil back into it to reshape the landscape. All that earth gets compacted down to prevent erosion and runoff. They plant some sort of vegetation and clean the water if need be. An old mine can become any number of things, like a grassland, a home, or, in the case of ABCO, a farm. But does the land actually go back to what it was like before?
It's still fairly rare, I think, for reclamation to be done well.
Mike is reforesting a 2,500-acre surface mine that has already been reclaimed. But he says growing trees in the rocky, compacted soil is really challenging. They have to rip the soil sometimes 3 or 4 feet to plant anything here.
When you stop the mining, it doesn't mean that the pollution stops.
Layers of rock that have been deep in the earth for millennia are now exposed.
And so they become very active chemically when they're exposed to water. Pollutants leach off of those materials for decades, if not hundreds of years.
Hundreds of thousands of acres of mining land across the U.S. coalfields haven't been reclaimed yet.
If the mine is stopped and reclamation activity stops, these mines just sort of sit, often as, wastelands of bare soil and rock.
And there's a fear that as the coal industry continues to decline, more land could go to waste. ABCO hopes to expand its farm onto this patch of partially reclaimed land on the mine. But for now, it sits idle.
You can look out there and see all the nasty water just sitting out there and laying. It's awful, man. We ain't even allowed out there, and I'm assuming that's the reason we're not allowed out there.
What is most likely is that these mining companies will end up going bankrupt, leaving this partially or unreclaimed land without following through on the reclamation obligations.
Unreclaimed mining land can lead to more flooding and landslides.
The coal companies stopped working, which meant they also stopped fixing any of the problems that they had created.
Companies only became responsible for cleaning up old mines in 1977. Before that, they simply abandoned them. There are over 6 million acres of abandoned coal mines across the country, and they're releasing heavy metals and other toxins into the water and air.
You can come in and take some of these off.
Businesses like ABCO are working to both restore the land and provide jobs here in Boone County, as coal is on its way out. The farm has doubled in size since it broke ground in 2019.
Well, that's a lot of flowers. That's a lot of lavender. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of employment.
Along with employing former coal miners, ABCO also hires people in long-term drug recovery.
I like working here because they gave me the opportunity to show that my past is in the past. They were still willing to work with me, and it was great that somebody gave me a chance to show that I can do this. And so when we reclaim, we don't just reclaim land. We reclaim land, people, communities, everything.
Reclaiming mine land is one step toward a post-coal future. The Biden administration has committed to investing $260 million in reclamation efforts for states and tribes. And ABCO hopes to use some of that money to expand the business to more of West Virginia.
If that is funded, it will enable us to set up a new farm location in a neighboring county and set up a regional community hub there.
But the U.S. government is still adding one more hurdle to cleaning up abandoned mine land. The proposed infrastructure bill would reduce the tax on coal production that funds these reclamation projects.
The Appalachian region, they've sacrificed a lot for energy that has really built this country. We, as a nation, owe it to this region to fix some of these inadequacies.
Appalachia has a long way to go to clean up the mess created by generations of mining. But these flowers give hope for a blossoming future.
A lot of times you get a ripple effect in the water, right? We don't make a ripple, we make a wave.
The people who live in Delhi produce about 10,000 tons of waste every day, which all end up in one of 3 giant landfills, including this one in the neighborhood of Bhalswa, The trash here has a bad habit of catching fire and causing major health problems for the people who live in the area. It's also become what's known as a super emitter, a hotspot for dangerous greenhouse gases. Thousands of people risk their lives collecting trash in one of India's largest landfills. They sort all kinds of waste, even used syringes. In recent years, fires have become more and more common, threatening people who work here and live nearby. The Bhalswa landfill burned for 2 months starting in April. When temperatures soared over 110 degrees Fahrenheit in New Delhi. Sahabuddin lost plastic and scrap metal he'd been collecting for years. Firefighters extinguished the open flames after about 2 weeks. But people here are still struggling to breathe because they've lived next to the smoldering plumes the whole time.
उसकी लाइफ तो समझिए बहुत ही नर्क लाइफ है.
As garbage piles up and the planet warms, landfill fires are expected to get worse. We went to India to meet the people who make their living next to a flaming mountain of worldwide waste. Every day, the tens of millions of people that live in the city of Delhi generate 10,000 metric tons of waste. Nearly all of it ends up in one of 3 surrounding landfills.
Now, most of these dump sites have gone beyond their capacity and they're overflowing with waste. And that's the real problem today.
Bhalswa was supposed to close more than 10 years ago, but it keeps accepting garbage, up to 600 truckloads every day. Backhoe operators like Rahul move the waste to make pathways for the trucks to drive to the top.
जनता के लिए काम कर रहे हैं, सब बना रहे हैं रास्ते.
Around 75,000 people, known in India as rag pickers, make their living in Delhi's dumps.
सारा बिकता है, ऐसा कुछ बात नहीं है. जब अब 1 रुपए किलो बिके चाहे 8 ना, सब बिक रहा है. जब
देखो जी, मेन तो हमारा स्क्रैप का काम है, प्लास्टिक का भी है, मतलब रद्दी का भी है, हर चीज़ का है, लेकिन अपना मटेरियल अलग अलग करके जब बेचता.
The average rag picker earns 200 to 300 rupees a day, about $3 to $4, with plastic and metal being the most valuable items collected. Even when they're not on fire, the landfills pose major health risks.
हाँ, मक्खियाँ भी हैं, मक्खियों की भी दिक्कत है. सुबह क्या, शाम क्या, दोपहर क्या, हर टाइम में मक्खी रहती है. देख भी रहोगे आप लोग यहाँ पे, इससे भी दिक्कत है. अब ये क्या, ये मक्खी गंदगी तो है ही है, गंदगी की वजह से खाने वाने पे बैठती है, तो उससे भी दिक्कत ही है हम लोगों को. ये तो सब चीज़ से दिक्कत है यहाँ पे.
Dr. Jivasau has been treating patients who work at the Bhalswa landfill for over 20 years.
डेली कमाते, डेली खाते हैं, मजबूरी है. जो बहुत लेबर क्लास के लोग ऐसे 10 दिन, महीना दिन कमाया खाया, और जो कुछ बचता है लेकर के गाँव भाग जाते, गाँव देहात चले जाते.
Bhalswa doesn't have a proper drainage system, so runoff from the landfill makes its way into the groundwater.
पानी यहाँ बहुत ही बेकार आता है. दिल्ली गवर्नमेंट के भी पानी बेकार आती है, और ऑलरेडी यहाँ तो ज़मीन के जो पानी है वो ले ही नहीं पाता है, कारण ज़मीन के पानी इतनी कड़वी और इतनी जहर है, तो ज़मीन के पानी तो लोग इस्तेमाल नहीं करते हैं.
Scientists use the Air Quality Index, or AQI, to measure air pollution, and India has one of the worst measures in the world. One study said air pollution led to more than 1.6 million premature deaths in 2019. Then there's the odor.
स्मेल की भी गंध जो होती है, उसकी महक वो भी बर्दाश्त नहीं होती है. जब आग लगती है तो उसकी भी महक बर्दाश्त नहीं होती बिल्कुल भी.
Not to mention the everyday dangers of rag picking.
हर तरीके की परेशानी है, कहाँ तक परेशानी बताएं आपको। ये देखो, और दिखाऊँ आपको, पैरों में देख लो, ये देखो। डर तो हमेशा, आपको पता ही है कि डर हमेशा इंसान को रहती है।
So, how did the landfill fires start? Lithium-ion batteries, which are increasingly entering the waste stream, can spontaneously explode. But in India, the brutal heat wave was the most likely culprit.
कोई लगाता नहीं है यहाँ पर आग, क्यों? इससे तो हमारा काम चलता है, इससे तो हम 2-4 रुपए कमा के अपना पेट भरते हैं।
In addition to plastic and other trash, the methane from decomposing garbage fuels fire. And these fumes contain all kinds of chemicals, which can cause tuberculosis in the short term and cancer if inhaled over a long period of time.
हाँ लगाते हैं, हमारे बच्चे लगाते हैं, स्कूल जाते हैं तो लगाते हैं। नहीं, पार्क तो यहाँ कोई नहीं है, बच्चे खेलते ही नहीं है, फिर भी तो टाइम ही नहीं मिलता। पहली बात तो इतना, बच्चे स्कूल जाते हैं, स्कूल से घर पे होमवर्क।
The fires make a bad situation worse.
नहीं तो धुआं इतना होता था, पहले रह नहीं पाते थे, इसलिए क्या करूं, कबाड़ा बचाऊं क्या धुएं से मरूं।
Sahebuddin has lived and worked at Bhalswa all his life.
अब क्या करूं, अब ना माँ बाप तो अपना जिंदगी हमारा बनाए नहीं, ठीक है। 1984 से मेरा यहाँ, ये मेरे 2 भाई का जन्म है यहाँ का पैदाशी मैं, इसी यहाँ का पैदाशी मैं हूँ, ठीक है, इसी जगह का।
He set aside a large pile of scrap metal and plastic as a kind of life savings he was planning on trading in. Then the fires came.
जब से कबाड़ा चुगना जलने के लिए, जब मेरा कबाड़ा जल गया, जब से मेरा नुकसान हो गया, तब से मैंने कबाड़ा चुगना बंद कर दिया। मंडी में जाता हूँ, भीख मांगता हूँ।
Putting out these fires requires a lot of manpower and equipment.
मेरा काम यही है कि कहीं आग लगे वहाँ जाके आग बुताओ, मशीन से बुताते हैं। 9 से 8 बजे 6 बजे तक रहते हैं, फिर अपने अपने रूम पे जाते हैं सर।
It took 80 trucks and 200 firefighters to quench the flames that burned from April to June. But mostly, these fires fizzle out on their own.
हाँ, पहले भी मतलब 4-5 दिन लगे थे, अब क्या तो भैया वो एक महीना से ही होने को आ रहा है, धीरे धीरे करके। पिछले साल भी लगी थी, जब हम आए थे यहाँ पे, जब भी लगी थी, और इस साल तो और ज़्यादा ही लगी है।
It is only improves in certain months which are in and around monsoon. After the monsoon, you will find that, because of the heavy rainfall, it subsides and your particulate matter goes down and the air quality just comes up a little bit. So the respite is for a brief period.
Locals want these sites removed.
गवर्नमेंट से यही कहेंगे कि इसको या तो हटा दो या फिर यहाँ कुछ बनवा दो, जिससे मतलब पेड़ पौधे लगा दो, जैसा शुद्ध हवा आए, इससे वातावरण अच्छा हो, तो सबको मतलब खुशहाली मिलेगी इस चीज़ से।
And the local government was fined nearly $65,000 for not taking proper measures to prevent the fire. The Delhi government told us it's working to remove all 8 million metric tons of waste from this site by the end of 2023. Since 2019, the government has operated what are known as trommels that separate recyclable trash from what can be burned to create energy. The rest of the leftovers are supposed to get moved to a different dump site. Delhi plans on opening another waste processing facility here by 2025 and is supposed to expand services for rag pickers. Activists say one solution to the ever-growing landfill is separating the waste before it gets there.
If you can reduce the waste amount by taking away the recyclables and the wet waste or the bio waste, very small quantities will go to the landfill.
Despite the increasing garbage problem, the amount of waste Indians create per person is far lower than richer countries. Every day, the average American throws out 8 times as much plastic garbage as the average Indian. But India's recycling industry is kept afloat by informal rag pickers who make pennies a day.
तो कबाड़ा तो अगर नहीं चुगा जाएगा तो बहुत दिक्कत है। इससे तो बहुत जो चुगने वाले से लेके फैक्ट्री वाले तक, तो इससे तो बहुत बड़े-बड़े पैसे वाले लगे जुड़े पड़े हैं।
For years, India's federal government has tried to crack down on waste with tougher laws, banning most single-use plastic.
I think everything has been prescribed, but unfortunately, it's the state government and the municipal people who are not following the rules at this point of time.
While these solutions are debated and parts of the landfill continue to smolder, the people dependent on it go out for another day of work because they have no other choice.
काम ही यही है, ये तो जलता ही रहता है, कभी पत्थर आके गिर रहा है, कभी आग जल रही है, तो ऐसा तो चलता ही रहता है।
इतना मेहनत है बाबूजी, अब हम कहाँ करें, हमारे बात तो कोई सुनवाई नहीं है। इस ज़माने में वही तो बात है ना, जिसका पैसा है उसी का वोट है, जिसका पैसे नहीं है उसका कुछ नहीं है इस दुनिया के अंदर।
हो सकती है पर क्या करें, इतना मजबूरी है तो चलाना ही पड़ेगा।
बेकार है भाई साहब, ये ज़िंदगी से बेकार है, फिर भी इंसान क्या करे, पेट तो पालना ही है।
The Ganges is one of the most polluted rivers in the world, mostly because it's filled with untreated sewage. But here's a type of waste you might not expect: leftovers from religious rituals. Each garland in this garbage truck started as an offering to the gods. After they're used in worship, tons of them get dumped into rivers or the sea every day, alongside other religious leftovers, like idols, immersed in waterways at yearly festivals. Now, a handful of startups are proving they can make money by turning flower waste into natural dyes, incense, and products sold by international brands. So far, these companies have together handled thousands of tons of temple leftovers. Can this upcycling keep rivers clean while respecting an ancient practice? We went to India to see how entrepreneurs are cashing in on sacred flowers. Dadar Flower Market is one of the largest in Mumbai. The main customers are smaller vendors who weave them into garlands to sell elsewhere, like outside the nearby Siddhivinayak temple. But about 40% of the flowers produced in India don't actually sell, including these ones piling up behind the market street. The offerings that do make it inside temples pose another challenge. Most Hindus consider it disrespectful to throw them in the trash, opting to return them to nature instead. Some people bury leftover offerings in gardens or flower pots. Others leave them out for animals to munch on. But for temples that have to dispose of tons of offerings, they often have few options besides dumping them in local waterways, which in India are already contaminated with industrial pollution and raw sewage. Even though flowers are natural, tossing tons of them into the water has consequences. Pesticides and other harmful chemicals sprayed on flower crops can affect water's pH. And as bacteria eat the organic waste, they use up oxygen, putting the entire ecosystem at risk. Rupa Trivedi grew up offering flowers at temples. She started to pay attention to the impact of religious waste about 15 years ago. So she started a Div Pure Nature to turn flowers into natural dye for clothing.
I thought that if I could recycle and reuse something out of it, even if it will be only a drop in the ocean, even a drop will make a difference. And I really wanted to set up a business which had some soul in it and which could always represent that soul to the world.
Ulhas, one of Rupa's employees, is stationed outside the temple for a few hours every day. He disassembles garlands and sorts the flowers by color. Twice per week, another worker, Chiman, travels 15 kilometers each way to collect used offerings. The temple parts with the flowers for free, but Rupa says paying workers to sort and collect temple offerings actually costs more than buying new flowers for her fabrics.
It is definitely more expensive. The purpose is that there are temple blessings that are recycled. And so there is a definite meaning to the flowers here.
At the workshop in Mumbai, workers unload the haul. They separate petals from the stems by hand.
So the marigolds are segregated and they are converted into petals and then it's kept for drying.
Marigolds are one of the most popular flowers. In Hinduism, they're said to be beloved by many different deities. Each flower has several meanings. It's believed gods and goddesses each have their preferences, like hibiscus for Ganesha, holy basil for Vishnu, or pink lotus for Lakshmi. Adiv's process uses a combination of fresh and dried petals, which workers lay here to dry out. Meanwhile, others take on the more technical task of preparing the fabrics. The dyeing team weighs the material and calculates the rest of the recipe. They measure out other ingredients that help color attach to fibers, and then add it all to hot water. Once it reaches about 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit, it's ready. The dyers lay out the damp fabric and begin applying petals.
This is the core technique that we've come up with, which is called the eco print.
तो नेचर का कैसा काम है, लाड वाला नहीं है काम, ये कैसा है, हर काम में टाइम लगता है, तो उसमें मैं थोड़ा सा.
This steamer helps the natural pigment transfer to the fabric. Mukhtar and Tabassum have each worked here for more than a decade.
अभी काम तो हम लोग ही आगाज किए जहाँ तक कि तो काफ़ी प्यार हो गए काम से, ऐसा नहीं कि नहीं, तो हम लोग ही पूरा स्टाइल है, जितने भी टेक्सचर वगैरह.
अच्छा लगता है, अच्छा है, सब लोग अच्छे हैं और मैडम है, मुख्तार है, ये लोग सब मतलब एक परिवार के हिसाब से, इसलिए मैं इतना टाइम यहाँ पे टिकी भी, रुक गई.
एक तो भगवान का फूल होता है काफ़ी, और वो फिर लोगों के पैर वगैरह में नहीं आए, तो कुछ अच्छे काम में यूज हो रहा है.
The team washes the fabric in water and hangs it on a line to dry. Some natural dyes have unexpected results, like red roses, which can actually turn fabric blue with the right techniques.
And every time I've showed this as a scarf to anyone, they are just kind of flabbergasted that how can you get this red roses be this color.
These roses mainly come from the Haji Ali Mosque, where they were used as decorations. Rupa says the mosque provides up to 100 kilograms of flower waste each week, while the Siddhivinayak temple can provide that much in a single day. Adiv used to send its petals to a local composter, but the pandemic put a pause on that.
We have no option but to throw them away, and I am hoping that maybe very shortly we'll be able to do what we were doing before.
So for now, the petals still end up in the trash, but not polluting waterways or littering the streets. From here, the dyed fabric heads next door to the garment makers. Al-Bab has worked here for 17 years.
टेलर की दुकान में काम सीखा और फिर बहुत सारी जगह काम करने के बाद यहाँ आया और यहाँ आया तो फिर कहीं नहीं गया. मैं बताया मैं आज अभी टेलर था, अगर वो नहीं मेरे को उस दिन वो बोली होती, एक्चुअली आप मानेंगे नहीं, मैं रियल बोल रहा हूँ, संडे भी ना बहुत घर पे कटता नहीं है, काम पे आने की ऐसे होती है, हम लोग छुट्टी नहीं करते.
Rupa says hiring people who might have trouble finding work was one of her main goals when starting the business.
I believe that each of us have an artistic quality in us. It is inherently there, whether dormant or completely alive.
Altogether, Adiv processes about 40 metric tons of petals from the nearby mosque and temple each year, not counting the stems, plastic bits, and other stuff they can't use. But that's still less than half of the flower waste those places of worship produce. Adiv isn't the only business taking on India's religious leftovers. Ankit Agarwal founded Phool, which is the Hindi word for flower, in 2017. The company turns flower waste into incense.
When I decided to quit my job and come back to Kanpur, the reaction of the people I knew was, I've gone bonkers, that I want to leave a job as an automation scientist and work with temple flowers.
Full's process also starts with collecting from temples, followed by sorting, depedaling, and drying. Once the petals are dry, the team grinds them into a fine powder. It's mixed by hand with water and essential oils until it reaches a clay-like texture. Then, it's time to roll. Workers dip their fingers into the flour powder while rolling to create an even thickness. The company employs more than 700 women. Many of them used to work as waste scavengers.
We have been able to provide them with health benefits, insurances, retirement benefits, and even a busing service.
The team lets the sticks dry before dipping them again in essential oils. Each worker can produce over 500 incense sticks in an hour. Ankit says that in the beginning, temples were reluctant to hand over the sacred flower waste.
So there's this line in the Hindu Aarti which says, Tera tujhko arpan, which basically means what belongs to the gods goes back to the gods. So this is how I used to convince them that these flowers don't belong to you or me, they belong to the gods.
They've also started making vegan leather and a plastic foam alternative from the offerings. Another company called Help Us Green makes incense and fragrances from flower waste.
All these flowers are converted into incense sticks and holy colors with the help of rural women, thereby empowering them and providing a better livelihood for their next generation.
Ultimately, flower waste is widespread. The United States imports over 1 billion short-lived blooms each year just for Valentine's Day. In India, flower recycling is on the rise. And these 3 startups handle thousands of tons of the waste annually. Over time, that can make a real dent in the 2 million tons of loose flowers the country produces each year. Meanwhile, other religious rituals have an impact too. At annual ceremonies, believers submerge idols representing Hindu deities in water. Afterwards, cleanup crews fish some statues out of the water. But it's difficult to get them all. Those made of clay will dissolve, but some are made of plaster, which sticks around for years. They can kill fish and plants, and even block the natural flow of water. The good news is that awareness of these impacts is on the rise, and some people are adapting by submerging idols in tanks of water that are easier to clean up. Rupa says that even though she no longer practices these rituals herself, she still sees the beauty in them.
Any human who's going in to offer these offerings to the gods is going with the purest of his heart.
One environmental educator said with increased awareness, people will modify their rituals.
Hinduism and nature go hand in hand. Faith teaches us to respect, to protect the environment.
You can't ask someone to stop doing a practice which he or she has been doing for generations. What we can do is make an economy around it so that everyone benefits.
Meanwhile, Indian waterways face even more pressing problems. Only about 1/3 of India's urban homes are connected to a sewer system. Cities spew 16,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of untreated sewage into India's seas and rivers every day. Rupa says even in challenging conditions, artistry can thrive.
An artisan can be global and universal. He does not need to reside by the beautiful flowing river and have the trees swaying just outside his workplace. It can be in this polluted city.
At Adiv Pure Nature, the team uses other waste products as ingredients too, like coconut waste, which can dye fabric pink.
This is what I recycle by taking them from the coconut vendors on the roadside.
The company's main customers have included U.S. clothing companies like Anthropologie and Eileen Fisher. Even with big brands on board, Adiv isn't turning a profit yet.
We have been very lucky to get some very nice buyers who have constantly kept us going and appreciating our work. But the company has also been growing along with it. Expenses have been mounting along with it.
But right now, Rupa's mind is on other things. For the past year, she's undergone treatment for cancer.
It has been extremely debilitating for me myself. I had come to a point where I was just talking to my manager and telling her, I need to close this down.
But her team stepped in and volunteered to take on her workload.
Rupa's been supporting us all our lives, so it's now my time to give away my best for her. She's being like a mother figure for all of us.
They have said that, ma'am, you are coming back. And I think that has been my inspiration, just to stay alive. Let me put it very frankly. My illness was where it is much more a death sentence than staying alive. But I think I'm existing because of this inspiration that has been with me all the time.
Remember Centralia, PA? It turns out India has its own version of this natural disaster. The neighborhood of Jharkhand in Jharkhand looks like a scene from another world. For over a century, coal mines here have been burning relentlessly beneath the surface. Here, teenage miners breathe in toxic fumes and scald their hands and feet while they work.
Rinki Kumari has been working at India's largest coalfield since she was only 8 years old.
पूरा जोड़ लगा के काटना पड़ता, आप तो देख ही रहे होंगे.
It's technically illegal for her to be here,
देखिए करता.
but she risks her life every day to help feed her family. She inhales toxic smoke and often burns her hands and feet.
अपना जान को खेल के देने के लिए सुरक्षा का सामान कुछ भी नहीं, हम लोग ऐसा ही आते हैं.
But at 17, she still endures these brutal conditions with a smile.
बहुत थक जाते, जैसे लेके जाने के बाद अपना बिस्तर पर पड़ जाते.
We followed this young woman to see why people here keep working in such a risky business, generation after generation.
जैसे मेरा मम्मी लाती थी अकेले में, तो हमको देखा नहीं जाता था. तो मेरा मम्मी अकेले कितना लाएगी, तो बोली साथ में चलो, तो अपना मम्मी का साथ में ही आते हैं, मतलब उसका हेल्प कर देते हैं.
Rinki and her mom stop and pray to Kali, the goddess of death, on their way to the Jharia coalfield. Coal collectors built this shrine to honor people who died here. Most of the official mines are operated by a subsidiary of government-owned Coal India called Bharat Coking Coal Limited, or BCCL. People like Rinki dodge police to sneak in and scavenge.
पटक के कोयला पटक दिया, भाग गई. टोकरी को छोड़ के 2 बार तो मेरा टोकरी भी चल गया.
The best time to avoid getting caught is from 4 to 10 in the morning. Any later in the day, it gets feverishly hot.
वहाँ तापमान रहता, गर्मी रहता, हम लोग जलने का मतलब कि पूरा जल हो जाते धूप से, और बाहर आते तो हवा लगता.
Rinki has been injured a few times.
इस्तेमाल करते हाथ जरूर भी जाता, आग उग रहता है तब है. जैसे यहाँ पे हम कोयला के अंदर है ना, उसमें घुस गया था, गड्ढा हो गया था अपने आप, तो घुस गया था.
She lost a friend in the mines a few years ago.
पर अचानक से वो मतलब कोयला काट ही रही थी, पर उसका अंदर है ना धंसान गिर गया उस पर. तो उसका परिवार को बहुत तकलीफ हुआ कि जो मतलब हमको कमा के देती थी वो चली गई.
Rinky's friend Lakshmi is just 12 years old. And she often collects the same amount of coal as an adult. Rinky's basket weighs as much as she does, around 90 pounds. Rinky walks about 8 miles a day, making several trips from the mine to her home to drop off the coal.
जैसे कि हम लोग उतना दूर से आए, अब देखिए इतना नीचे उतरेंगे और कितना दूर है, देखिए कितना नीचे उतरना पड़ता है, ये रास्ता कितना कठिनाई, कभी भी हम लोग गिर सकते हैं।
When she gets home, she cooks the coal to make it usable as fuel.
जैसे अभी लगाएं तो रात भर लग ही जाएगा और इसको पकने के लिए यही 6-7-8 घंटे लगेगा।
Rinky makes about 800 to 900 rupees a week selling coal in the market to locals and restaurants. In India, that's about $11, roughly the cost of a pair of sneakers. But the risks don't end when she leaves the mines. And the same thing that helps Rinky support her family is also making them sick. Coal deposits contaminate nearby rivers and streams, especially during monsoon season.
और जैसे कि पानी लाने को बहुत समस्या यहाँ पे है, तो पानी लाते हैं कुआं से और फिर घर का काम करते, बर्तन उर्तन झाड़ू पोछा। आगे मैया।
Nearby hospitals like this one are overflowing with patients who work in the mines. Dr. Ramesh Kumar Sharma sees about 150 patients a day.
हेल्थ प्रॉब्लम जैसे ब्रोंकाइटिस हो गया, आजमा का केस हो गया, रेस्पिरेटरी प्रॉब्लम ज़्यादा है।
Jharia's air quality is one of the worst in the world. The coal underground has been burning for more than 100 years. Experts say it catches fire on its own when exposed to oxygen. Flammable gases like methane and carbon monoxide seep through homes.
ये गैस है ना बहुत जहरीला होता है, ये अगर मुंह में चल गया तो उल्टी तबीयत पूरा खराब हो जाती है।
The floor in her house is always hot.
इसलिए हम लोग देखिए गर्म के कारण हम लोग बोरा बिछा के रखे हुए हैं। डर तो लगता, फिर भी तकलीफ से हम लोग रह रहे हैं। आग जैसे बढ़ जाएगा तो ये सब तो नष्ट ही हो जाएगा, नष्ट हो जाएगा। देखते हैं हम लोग को कहाँ घर मिलता, तो वहीं फिर हम लोग जाएंगे।
The mining company frequently explodes dynamite to expose the coal. That's destabilized the entire neighborhood of Jharia, creating cracks in the earth and swallowing up homes.
बूम सा आवाज आता है और फिर प्रदूषण बहुत उड़ता है। वो प्रदूषण को लेते हैं तो खांसी, तबीयत खराब हो जाती है।
Rinky's house, made of concrete blocks, is slowly sinking.
और घर में आने के बाद मेरा घर पहले ऊंचा था, पहले हम इसमें टकराते नहीं थे, अब टकरा जाते हैं।
Rinky's father remembers what life was like in Jharia when they moved here in 2005.
हम तो यहाँ देखें कि जिस समय आए थे यहाँ का स्थिति बहुत अच्छा था, रौनक भी था, लोग कमा खा रहे थे.
Now, the fires have spread so much that BCCL is moving thousands of families out of Jharkhand. But the process has been slow. Many locals say they don't want to move far away from the mines where they work. Others are mistrustful of BCCL's motives.
फिर हम लोग को भगाने के लिए BCCL रच रहा है, रचना कि आप लोग को भी भगा करके यहाँ से कोयला हम निकालें.
Insider reached out to BCCL for comment but did not hear back. Coal consumption is on the decline in many countries, but not here. India is the second largest consumer in the world. Coal fuels 70% of the electricity grid. And with a nationwide energy shortage unfolding, the government is doubling down. It plans to reopen 100 old mines this year. But Rinki doesn't want to be here forever. 4 years ago, she got an opportunity that could change her life. She joined the Coalfield Children classes run by an NGO. About 100 kids are enrolled here.
और ऐसे तो हम पढ़ ही रहे हैं, पर चाहते जैसे सवेरे हम कोयला लाने, वही सवेरे हम अगर पढ़ाई करें तो कितना बढ़िया हो.
And she has big dreams.
जैसे मेरा ड्राइंग बहुत अच्छा है, जैसे हम पेंटर भी बनना चाहते हैं और जितना भी काम है, मतलब हमको जो जो पसंद है, बैंकिंग में जॉब करना, नर्सिंग करना, ये सब जो मिल जाए, ब्यूटिशियन भी जानते हैं, मेहंदी लगाना भी जानते हैं.
Even though she's still figuring out her next step, Rinki tries to find bright spots in the risky job she must keep doing for now.
नहीं, ऐसे हम साइकिल चलाने हमको पसंद है. हम साइकिल से कोयला लाते हैं ना, तो हमको बहुत पसंद है. उसमें चला के ले जाना पड़ता.
Indonesia struggles with dirty air, unclean water, and gigantic landfills. Here are a few stories about the people trying to make a living in the most polluted places in the country.
Scavenging for rusted scrap metal is one of the only ways widows in Jakarta can make money. The women search for iron and steel from used ships in one of the most polluted waters in the world. Datri is 63 years old, but she has been the main breadwinner for her 3 kids since her husband died.
Kadang-kadang saya cuma keluarin air mata aja ya susah. Iya. Kadang sampai saya kadang bingung. Kadang saya bingung ya.
Everything she touches has poisonous layers of rust.
Ini masih ada tuh. Nih, tuh. Ini baru dikelakep.
Ship recycling is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. And massive yards across the world break down everything from cruise liners, cargo vessels, and oil tankers to naval warships. But these women make only about $2 a day selling small pieces. So why are so many widows stuck scavenging like this? And what makes it such a risky business? Every morning, Datri leaves her 10-month-old granddaughter behind and goes to work. She has always had a job, even before she got married at 19.
Ke Jakarta karena saya kan pengen ngikut suami nyari makan sendiri.
But things have been tough since her husband passed away 13 years ago. Widows often struggle to find jobs in Indonesia because many believe they can bring bad luck. But the owner of this ship-breaking company lets widows scavenge for free.
8. Iya, sekarang ada 8.
Pernah rebutan nggak?
Enggak bareng-bareng aja.
the women are only allowed to collect small pieces like these. The larger chunks belong to the ship owners to sell or reuse.
Kalau segini, awan, domelin, nggak boleh, aku di stop. Gua penuhin karungnya.
Most of the valuable pieces are underwater near the ships. Detri uses a magnetic stick to find the metal.
Paling parah kalau lagi licin, banyak oli, lumpur, jalannya susah. Takut sakit, takut kepleset.
"13 rivers empty into Jakarta Bay, carrying with them sewage, toxins, and all kinds of trash. Detri's thick gloves and socks don't always protect her. Once, she stepped on a nail that went right through her foot.
Saya sampai 5 bulan nggak sembuh. Sampai dibawa suntik ke PPP Rumah Sakit Pelabuhan.
Welders are constantly sawing off hot pieces of metal, so she has to be careful.
Nembus, jadi nempel.
Detri says even though the job is dangerous, she's still proud of making her own money.
Karena cari makan. Biar makan gimana caranya. Yang penting masih sehat hidup.
Around noon, the women escape the heat with a quick lunch break. There are about 10 million widows like them across Indonesia, and most live in extreme poverty. Some turn to sex work to survive. Others are forced to send their children to work to make ends meet. Amina wanted to avoid that, so she took this job at the scrapyard 37 years ago.
Jadinya udahlah, saya lebih baik nyari karat. Ya anak-anak ibaratnya ditinggal pada sekolah.
Today, at 61 years old, she has many health issues, including severe arthritis.
Kaki ini nih, kadang-kadang bengkak. Kalau nggak di sini bengkak, di sini bengkaknya. Jalan-jalan bengkaknya. Pokoknya nggak bisa nggak minum obat.
And she's afraid she will run out of breath and drown because she has heart problems.
Karena kalau kumat, udah dari sini masuk ke sini, nusuk ke belakang. Panas perih, sakitnya kayak apa.
On a really good day, she collects as much as 200 kilograms and sells it for almost $3. With that, she can buy about 4 cups of rice for dinner. Her salary isn't enough to pay for her treatments. But she's too sick to find another job.
Berdiri, kalau gosok kan berdiri. Nggak kuat kakinya. Kerja lain kerja apa sih, Nak? Nyuci, gosok saya nggak bisa.
Nowadays, her children work, but Amina still helps with all the bills. And she'd rather scavenge than go into debt.
Enggak, saya nggak kapok. Sayang lah ibaratnya di rumah deh, bengang-bengong.
The widows sell the rusted scraps to Narwin, a middleman.
Kalau kualitas karat yang bagus ya dia bening, nggak kotor, nggak hitam. Kalau yang jelek ya hitam kotor.
This is one of 2 shipbreaking yards in Jakarta. It takes 20 workers at least a week to cut down an entire ship, depending on its size. Most ships have a lifespan of 25 to 30 years, after which they are retired. But they have hazardous materials inside. Things like asbestos in pipes, heavy metals in paints, biological hazards from sewage tanks, radioactive material from gauges, and the list goes on. Left unchecked, they can seep into the soil, beach, and water near shipbreaking yards and destroy local marine habitats. But there are also many usable parts of a ship, including metal bars and plates. Those are recycled and sometimes used to make new ships or heavy machinery. Experts say this is a greener alternative to producing new steel, which uses a lot of energy. And it also saves the planet from more metal mining. So while workers like Datri and Amina play a crucial role in building a more sustainable industry, the profits and the praise are not trickling down to them. Both widows live in this colony. It's one of the poorest areas in Jakarta. Most of their neighbors also break down ships at the scrapyard or fish along the coast. Datri raised her 3 sons here mostly on her own. Her husband died when the youngest was just 11. And she never considered marrying again.
Karena dulu suami saya galak. Saya pernah ditonjok, pernah diapa, pernah. Saya seneng itu piara anak sendiri, yang penting bisa makan.
Turun mau makan, imannya mau berangkat nih. Turun.
Now her kids are all grown up. But she shares her home with one of her sons and helps support his wife and their baby.
Nenek mau berangkat, jaman ya. Ini tangan bagus lah.
Menurut saya sih Bu Datri harusnya nggak usah kerja. Tapi mau gimana lagi, namanya ngebantu untuk kerja, menghidupin sehari-hari. Kasian aja, udah tua, umur udah kayak gitu, terus harus banting tulang.
Her other kids rely on her too.
Kemarin aja punya cincin 3 gram ya. Anak saya tuh kontrakan, daripada diusir orang saya kasihin. Bener. Udah mendingan saya lebaran gak pakai cincin daripada anak saya diusir orang. Itu boleh ngumpulin cincin.
Datri says her faith in God has helped her through the tough times.
Ya itu terserah yang kuasa yang ngatur saya masih sehat. Yang penting masih sehat hidup. Alhamdulillah. Amin aja.
For almost 2 decades, this man has climbed a mountain of trash. He scavenges for anything he can sell or bring to his family.
Yang dipikirin ya begitu, ketakutan aja, takut longsor, takut ya alat berat lah. Bagaimana alat berat bawa sampah sih. Kadang-kadang yang bawa alatnya nggak ketahuan orang gitu.
Rasidin and thousands of others are one of the main ways trash gets sorted, sold, reused, and sometimes recycled here in Indonesia. Many, like Indan, used to be rice farmers, but found they can make twice as much picking trash.
Sampah itu alhamdulillah berkah. Kalau yang
sering yang buang makanan itu seperti orang kaya, orang-orang seperti orang-orang tengah gitu.
So what's it like for the thousands of Indonesians who live off of other people's garbage? And how did this informal recycling industry become such a risky business? The Bantar Gebang landfill near Jakarta is the size of 200 football fields. It's one of the largest in the world. Around 6,000 people live in slums at its base. Indan has been living here for 2 years. At first, he was afraid to eat the food he collected from the mountain. But now,
yang tadi kita nemu itu alhamdulillah enak. Tadi saya nemu semacam wortel, bakso, terus kol. Bismillahirrohmanirrohim. Allahumma barik lana fima rojaktana wa qina adzabannar.
Ngapain?
Ya udah pada makan dulu. Enak dari sono juga. Ini dapat semut. Pernah sekali saya bawa makanan nyampe sini, tahu-taunya makanan udah nggak layak dimakan. Saya umpetin, ketemu sama anak, langsung dimakan, jadinya mencret.
a few houses away, Rasidin is getting ready to go out for the day.
Halo, kaos kaki, bolong sepatunya, Bu. Karena apa? Kalau nggak dikasih plastik, pasti tembus ke kaki. Makanya Bapak dikasih plastik.
Kenapa, Pak? Kenapa nggak?
Karena nggak ada duitnya. Mencukup segitu uangnya.
Dulu ya Bu ya, berangkat kerja. Doain ya Bu ya.
Mudah-mudahan paling sehat.
Amin.
Berdoalah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allah ya Allah, ya Allahku, ya Allah, ya Allah, ya Allah. Mugi-mugi dikabulkan ya Allah, Allah ya Allah. Mohon dikabulkan ya Allah.
1,300 trucks arrive here every day, mostly from Indonesia's capital, Jakarta. People doing this work call themselves pemulung, which translates to scavenger. They work independently, but need permission from the government to enter the landfill. The biggest dangers on the job are the excavators. They are owned and operated by the Jakarta provincial government.
Sen, fotoin dong, Sen. Pak, fotoin ko dong.
They move the trash around so that this mountain doesn't collapse. Dani Kurniawan has been operating one of them for 18 years.
Jadi dengan adanya pemulung lumayan juga sih banyak fungsinya. Banyak semacam kayak plastik kan dikumpul sama mereka. Jadi mengurangi volume sampah ya dari dia orang. Makanya kita sebagai pekerja di sini ya biasa aja. Karena posisinya kita di sini udah tahunan ya. Jadi sama pemulung udah kayak keluarga aja. Kita nggak bisa apalagi posisi malam nih ya. Begitu kita garuk ada kayu apa beling apa batu ya kan kita garuk kita angkat tiba-tiba jatuh kena pemulung itu resiko saya.
Rasidin had a close call once.
Cara ngindari ya Bapak ke bawah didorong sama paket. Cuman salahnya ada bangkolan dari nyangkut ada kayu terus kelinjang ikatannya itu nyangkut. Jadi bapak ngegantung, nyelamatin bapak anak, semua datang.
But he continues to work near them because they usually operate where new trash arrives.
Ya apa aja, botol, tulang, ya seadanya aja di Bulog, yang bara pasti dijual gitu.
Recycling facilities mostly take bottles, cardboard, and metal. But local artisans will pay good money for bones to make jewelry.
Dulu mah memang iya masih bawa muntah-muntah, sekarang mah ya udah kalau omongan kasar tuh bangbal gitu. Udah tebel, bener Ibu. Ya rasanya puyeng. Ya paling kalau udah puyeng ya pengen pulang.
Methane's an invisible threat at Bantar Gebang. The gas comes from rotting food, wood, and paper. When there's too much of it, people can suffocate. And it can cause deadly eruptions. In 2005, trapped methane exploded at a dump site in Java and triggered an avalanche that buried dozens of homes and killed 143 people. Most of them were scavengers living near the landfill. But nothing stops Rasidin from coming to work.
Ya pernah kehujanan, keanginan. Kadang-kadang mau pulang aja hujan, ayo macok terus nyari emberan.
He makes around $25 a week. That's about a third of Indonesia's minimum wage, but still more than what farmers make.
Kalau Bapak sebenarnya lebih baik mulung daripada nggak makan.
Waduh, kayaknya lelah banget ini.
Ya, capean bos.
Panas. 14 kilo.
14 kilo ya?
Iya.
Ya udah, lumayan. Berapa sih harganya?
Rasidin sells his goods to middlemen like Adi, who then sells them to another trash buyer. As many as 20,000 families here depend on Bantar Gebang to make a living. This land used to be mostly forest and rice fields until the 1980s. Trash has been piling up ever since.
Ya bagaimana berhentinya kalau masih begini ceritanya mah nggak ada berhentinya. Kecuali kalau udah tua baru nggak boleh sama anak. Kalau sekarang juga nggak boleh, cuman terpaksa masa mengarepin aja anak.
Rasidin has 5 children, and he dreams they might one day make it out of here.
Ada yang jadi pemulung, orang tua pemulung, anaknya jadi pemulung. Ada yang bawa alat berat, ada yang bawa alat nyupir sampah, ada alat berat, ada yang masih sekolah, ada 2 yang udah kerja, ada belum pada sukses. Ya doain aja Bu, biar Bapak biar selamat usahanya.
Ya udah masuk.
And Indan has a message for the wealthy.
Maaf sama orang-orang kaya ini, kalau beli makanan jangan banyak-banyak, secukupnya aja buat anaknya. Jangan dibuang, sayang. Jangan dibuang dulu, kasih orang-orang yang susah seperti aku ini.
These oil wells are stuck in the past. And for over 100 years now, this has been the most lucrative job in this remote part of Indonesia, where the land has been ruined by toxic leaks. Workers risk their lives to extract the little that's left.
Ya gini kan gini, saya kan masih sehat, dia kan tercepit dikit ini, tercepit besi sama besi.
But they don't even own that oil. They're forced to sell to the state company, which locals say barely pays them enough to get by.
Ya takut nggak takut, namanya orang kepepet.
So why do these toxic old wells still exist? And how did thousands of people end up trapped working in them? Pani learned to extract oil when he was just 19. Now he is teaching his nephew.
Jadi sifatnya terpaksa. Kalau berhenti menambang, dihijaukan, nanti kehidupan keluarga berkurang.
Many of the 700 oil wells near his village in East Java were built by the Dutch in the late 1800s. Nowadays, locals own most of them, but only about 200 still work.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Pani always prays with his colleagues before starting his day.
Selamat kerja! Ya!
The basic tools they rely on are improvised and rustic. Like this engine they've removed from an old dump truck. They have to step on gas and brake pedals to dip and lift this pipe that goes in. It's called a baler. It has little holes in the side to let oil in and out. They need enough rope to lower the baler all the way down into the oil reserve. At this location, the crude is found about 1,000 feet below, a depth almost equal to the height of Indonesia's tallest building. When the baler hits the bottom, the holes open up inside, letting oil in. Then, when the rope starts tugging up, the holes close, trapping the oil inside the tube. Pani uses this heavy iron rod to guide the baler down. Sometimes accidents happen.
Ya gini kan gini, saya kan masih sehat, dia kan tercepit dikit ini. Tercepit besi sama besi.
The whole process is messy. Pani says he sometimes wears a mask to protect himself from the liquid that sprays out. But what he fears most is a possible explosion. The old equipment can overheat and catch fire. With all this oil around, an open flame can quickly spark an inferno. In June, a fire at another well in Sumatra killed 4 workers. It's also hard to maintain these wells over time. They're too narrow and far too deep for people to crawl in and fix from inside.
Dia alati kan sudah nggak kena itu, seperti pipa yang di dalam putus, untuk meluruskan susah. Nah, akhirnya harus membuat lagi di sampingnya akhirnya gitu. Tadi.
Sometimes mud clogs up the well and prevents the baler from reaching the oil.
Jadi sepertinya buntu gitu lah.
The extracted oil runs off into these pools. In its crude form, it's mixed with mud and water. The oil floats to the top in a matter of minutes, and workers scoop it out. Pani's nephew, Joko Mulyono, helps. They use a vacuum to transfer the oil onto the car. About 200 years ago, before these oil wells existed, crude naturally oozed out of the ground here. Locals gathered small amounts to light lamps and make medicine. But in 1887, the Dutch, who colonized Indonesia, set up a large-scale drilling operation. Their oil company, Royal Dutch, managed many wells and refineries in East Java, and brought in workers who were paid low wages to help work for them. As demand for oil boomed around the world, drilling in Indonesia expanded too, and this land became unrecognizable. The Dutch left after Indonesia gained independence in 1945. But the oil that had leaked from the wells had already polluted the surrounding earth and water, making farming, the work that had sustained locals long before these wells existed, much harder. Extracting oil became the most lucrative work, but there wasn't nearly as much as before. When Pani started this job in 2004, they could draw up to 900 gallons from this well in a day. Now it takes him 1 week to get 55 gallons. There's more underground, but the well is too shallow to reach it, and Pani doesn't have the machinery to drill deeper.
Tapi kalau buat harta benda yang kaya raya enggak bisa, karena keluarnya itu kan itu kejar-kejaran sama tetangga teman.
Even though workers own the land, the state-owned company Pertamina possesses the right to all the oil underground. So, by law, workers have to sell their oil to the company through a local government enterprise. But they often make more money selling it to off-the-radar refineries instead, where Pani can make 2 times what Pertamina would pay. Latest estimates from 2014 found that the state company was losing nearly $11 million annually to workers who sell their oil independently. Even after selling on the black market, workers still only make about $12 a week, which is not a lot, even in this part of Indonesia. That's why most of the workers bring lunch from home and share it with the others.
Sayur daun singkong. Cocok ini.
Pani pays his nephew Joko an additional $6 weekly to drive the oil to the refinery. That's become its own profession.
Kalau sekitar sini ya peduli sih Mbak sebenarnya. Tapi mau gimana lagi kalau di sini kan memang lokasi minyak penambangan. Mau nggak mau kita harus mengikutin gitu.
Joko has been at it for 16 years now. He used to make around 10 trips a day, each for a different well owner. But that's dropped down to just 4 or 5 on a busy day.
Ya kadang ya 3 atau 4, kadang ya sama sekali nggak ada. Tergantung minyak dari sumurnya keluarnya banyak atau dikit.
Pani's neighbor Jainuri processes the oil at this artisanal refinery using traditional techniques. He works 13-hour days, carrying 20-pound containers filled with crude up and down these hills. He dumps them into these 60-gallon drums. First, Jainuri lights this underground furnace. He'll use it to heat the crude in this drum. He fills it halfway to give it space to boil. It has to reach at least 570 degrees Fahrenheit before it starts evaporating, which is key to refining it. The vapor comes up through these pipes, which are cooled with water. That turns the vapor back into a liquid.
Bagian itulah mengeluarkan minyak dari pipa itu. Lama. Prosesnya lama.
They bring that refined fuel to the boiler and heat it once more, until it evaporates back through these pipes. Jainuri repeats this process 3 or 4 times to get different types of fuel, like gasoline and diesel.
Itu tradisi zaman dahulu. Zaman orang-orang tua mbah-mbah kami. Begini terus biar rakyat kita bisa makan.
All day long, workers here are breathing these fumes, a combination of nitrogen, methane, and carbon monoxide, which can cause cancer and brain damage. And if the gases get trapped underground, everything could explode.
Sebenarnya bahaya, cuma gimana lagi, soalnya adanya ya itu.
And an entire day's work only fetches about 1 drum of diesel. That's about enough to fill a car 3 times. Refineries are also required to sell their oil to Pertamina, but many sell at small black markets like this one. Locals buy oil for $2.27 per gallon. That's double what Pertamina would pay for it, although the price fluctuates based on global oil prices. The quality of the artisanal oil is inferior, so locals mostly use it to fuel the engines in their wells. Some also use it in their cars, because the nearest gas station is 60 miles away. That trip would cost them more in gas than they make in a day. Indonesia has enough oil reserves underground to power the entire country for at least 4 years. Still, it imports about half of the oil it consumes. And these artisanal workers aren't allowed to dig new wells on their own land. They could get all their oil extraction rights revoked. Instead, they have to allow large companies to drill on their property, a law the country passed in 2001 to boost foreign investment and ramp up oil drilling. That year, ExxonMobil discovered an oil field nearby and soon signed on to help Pertamina develop it, buying out 3,000 small landowners first. The plant started extracting in 2008 and now produces about 200,000 barrels annually, about a quarter of the country's oil output. But locals say what they really need from the government is funding for better machinery, so they can develop their fields themselves.
Tidak mempunyai cita-cita kok. Pemerintah membantu, saya tidak mengharapkan dan tidak meminta.
So workers find ways to make do on their own, because they say they have to. They keep digging more wells like these to tap as many shallow reserves as they can.
Ya dibilang ilegal ya ilegal, dibilang enggak ya enggak. Soalnya ini sudah turun-menurun, tinggalan Belanda zaman dahulu. Soalnya zaman Belanda yang ngusir orang-orang sini, harapannya ya harus tetap begini. Biar dikelola rakyat.
According to some estimates, output from illegally dug wells is outpacing production at the legal ones by about 10 barrels a day. Meanwhile, locals feel trapped in work that's damaged their land, and now seems like their only option for a stable income.
Kalau hati saya menggarap sumur yang seperti bebas seperti ini, hati saya tidak enak. Tidak enak, sebenarnya loh itu. Juga mengganggu apa-apa. Tapi berhubung kekuatan keluarga saya juga membutuhkan hasil, saya tetap ikut mengambil hasil dari minyak. Jadi sifatnya terpaksa gitu.
Pani's family grew mangoes here for generations. But for the last few years, his crops have kept dying.
Kalau saya sedih itu menyayangkan ini, gundul semua ini. Saya sedih sebenarnya. Tapi menghidupkan kan nggak bisa karena itu. Bagaimana kalau menyelesaikan kalau nggak ditangani pemerintah?
Still, he's grateful for every drop of oil he can get. And that it's made it possible for his daughter to go to school and to have a better life than he did.
Kalau uang dari sumur ini kan sekarang kecil, Bu. Buat biaya anak sekolah pun masih mencari, masih kurang.
Back in the United States, one of the most polluted neighborhoods in the country is just a short train ride away from New York City. Children with asthma are hospitalized at a rate 30 times higher than the rest of the country. The Ironbound neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey, is home to contaminants from multiple angles, which drove the community to speak up for some serious changes.
6 days a week, thousands of tons of garbage land in one tiny corner of New Jersey. This is the Ironbound. States up and down the East Coast send all kinds of waste here. There's also a factory that melts down animal parts from slaughterhouses, a 17-mile stretch of river full of cancer-causing chemicals, pollution from an international airport, a tangle of truck-filled highways, hundreds of lots where old businesses left behind toxic chemicals or other potential problems, and one of the largest sewage plants in the U.S.
People say it smells like New Jersey. It actually smells like the waste of the region, right?
The Ironbound is also one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the state.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
Most families here are working class, and more than half are Black or Latino.
We're just a dumping ground. There's so many waste-related facilities in addition to the incinerator.
Because we're not a poor city, we're a stolen from city. We've been exploited. People have been stealing and building their wealth off of our lungs, off of our backs.
Nationwide, Black Americans are 75% more likely than others to live near hazardous waste.
Enough is enough.
Children here grow up breathing pollution linked to cancer and heart attacks. And they have asthma at a rate more than 3 times higher than the rest of the country.
¿Están presentes, sí o no? Así.
I have asthma, my nephew has asthma, my mom has asthma. I'm assuming it's because we live in Ironbound, right?
But it can be very hard to prove who is responsible for what.
Really, the kicker is that we can never trace someone's asthma to a facility or to a truck. There's so many things in that neighborhood.
Locals have been fighting to clean up this neighborhood for more than 50 years. In 2020, they finally scored a big win. New Jersey passed a law that could stop major polluters from piling up in one place. But is one law enough to protect this community from hundreds of years of worldwide waste?
Stop dumping! Stop dumping!
Historians think the Ironbound got its name from the train tracks built around it in the 1800s, when industrialization transformed the whole city of Newark.
Any Jerseyite will tell you where this is, the 3rd busiest corner in the world.
By the 1960s, heavy industry dotted the riverfront, including oil refineries and chemical plants. In 1969, a group of residents banded together to lobby for more resources for the neighborhood. Eventually, they formed a nonprofit called the Ironbound Community Corporation, or ICC. Today, environmental justice is one of the main things they fight for. Melissa Miles started working for the ICC in 2016 as the environmental justice manager. She originally moved to the Ironbound to pursue a different passion of hers, an Afro-Brazilian martial art called capoeira.
One of the best masters on the East Coast was in the Ironbound. Then my life changed. I got married, I had a kid, and capoeira wasn't as important to me anymore, sadly.
What became very important to her was that the pollution was taking a toll on her family.
No one in my family has asthma. Now to date, both of my sons have had asthma attacks. It became really real for me. Like the things that they say happen to children who live around pollution happen to my children.
With the ICC, she helped organize truck counts, measure air quality, and map out local polluters.
I was actually really seeking what was my mission. What was the reason why I was in that neighborhood that was poisoning my kid? And so while I'm here, I better stand up in this community so that, something changes.
After 4 years advocating for the neighborhood, she took her fight to the state level and started work at the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. She's learned to keep going, even when progress is slow.
We look for small victories, right? The ability to talk to one person, to get out and table and meet young people, to get your cat off your table. Noodles, please.
In 2020, after 2 decades living in the Ironbound, she and her sons moved about 12 miles west to the suburban town of Summit. It has better schools and a lot less pollution.
We do miss Newark. They go back to Newark every weekend. Their dad still lives in the same apartment that they grew up in, across the street from the plastic factory.
That's the A1 Plastics Factory, which makes grocery bags. Its permit doesn't say how much it pollutes, and A1 didn't respond to numerous requests for comment on this story.
It's the type of facility you would never see in a place like Princeton or Montclair, but Newark is zoned for it.
A lot of the Ironbound is zoned so that factories and homes can be side by side, and a stretch of land right next to it is the only one in Newark approved for heavy industry. This kind of zoning is why a sewage plant, 3 gas-fired power plants, and the state's biggest garbage incinerator are allowed to be so close together, and so close to people's homes. And across the US, nearly 80% of these types of incinerators are in low-income or mostly minority neighborhoods. That's because historically, many local governments zone them that way. The company that operates this incinerator in the Ironbound is reckoning with the past.
We have many waste-to-energy facilities that are located in historically overburned communities.
In fact, every incinerator in New Jersey is. Still, Covanta supported the state environmental justice law and markets itself as a sustainable company.
I think people honestly think that we just have a bunch of 55-gallon drums in here and we're burning the garbage inside the building. They don't appreciate the effort that goes into doing it correctly.
That includes trying to minimize what comes out of the smokestack. Inside it, a lime slurry helps control acid gases like sulfur dioxide. And activated carbon helps turn mercury and dioxin gases into solids. Then at the baghouse, the gases pass through hose-like filters that catch solid particles.
That is a baghouse for boiler number 1. There's one for each boiler.
Dave Blackmore says he wants people to visit.
I think the most important thing would be for them to come here and see what we do.
Covanta even offers public tours on their website. And company representatives say they try hard to take feedback from the ICC.
I'm happy to say we do have a dialogue. Can it be better? Yes.
But the plant is still burning about 3,000 tons of trash almost every day. And that's exactly what the ICC is trying to stop.
Our community's been fighting this incinerator since before the incinerator was built. I have people, they used to come as children to the march against the incinerator. Now they bring their kids.
Maria Lopez Nunez has been organizing marches and rallies at the ICC for about 8 years. She also takes people on tours of pollution sources around the neighborhood, and Covanta Essex is one of the stops.
I think it's common sense, right? Common sense. Should you burn millions of tons of trash this close to people? No.
But most experts agree. Getting energy from trash is better than dumping it in a landfill. The ICC, however, says it's pushing for systemic changes that would be much, much better, but also much harder to pull off.
I want us to get to the next level, which is composting, reduction of consumer goods from the beginning. As long as we have incinerators, we don't have to address the real problems of how to handle our waste. We can just keep throwing things out, the garbage truck takes it, and for most of us, it disappears.
The state of New Jersey allows the incinerator to release certain amounts of all these pollutants, plus arsenic, mercury, and others.
The fact that we give a permit to pollute, right, that says it's acceptable.
Covanta says it actually releases a lot less than it's allowed to.
Facilities like this typically are a very small percentage of the local air pollution.
But that's partially because there's a lot of pollution to compete with. Industries around the Ironbound do billions of dollars in business every year, but residents say they don't reap any benefits.
You cannot eat money, oh. You cannot eat money, oh.
Last November, the ICC was fighting what would be the Ironbound's fourth natural gas power plant. They rallied community members to protest a proposal by the state-run sewage treatment facility. It says it needs the backup power to stop sewage from overflowing into the neighborhood during storms. Activists say they want the plant to use battery power and renewables instead of burning natural gas.
That, plus the garbage incinerator, fat rendering, Passaic Valley Sewage Facility, the airports, the ports, the brownfield, the Superfund site is like, enough is enough.
Any additional pollution coming to the Ironbound, which is already overburdened, it's wrong. Any amount is wrong.
2 months after this rally, Governor Phil Murphy put the project on hold. But now, despite the controversy, it's moving forward again. The Sewage Commission says it's considering other fuel sources, including renewables. Meanwhile, the ICC is also fighting to get the sewage plant to cover up its open-air waste treatment tanks. In an email to Insider, the sewage plant said that change is not feasible. Maria says the nonprofit is often scrambling to keep up, since the polluting industries just keep coming.
It makes our job incredibly hard because there'll be 3 or 4 permits all at the same time, and all these industries have lawyers and they can bankroll their defense of their corporations while we can't defend our community.
But a new law could change the way cities do business.
We're hoping that this is it, that S232 is that big policy breakthrough to finally address the issue.
S232, which most people just call the Environmental Justice Law, passed in 2020 after years of activism.
Environmental justice is having its moment, and this law is a part of that.
It probably won't go into effect until the end of 2022. State regulators spent about 2 years making an enforcement plan for the law and getting public feedback at hearings like this one. And residents have a lot on their minds.
We have one of the most progressive environmental justice laws in the nation, and the nation is watching. Are we going to make sure that people can't just pay their $1,000 an hour attorneys to find the loopholes and continue to poison our children?
And I want to remind us that this is where it starts, not where it ends. This law is the bare minimum.
You're going to see jobs move out of the state or not come into the state, and the benefits that these facilities can bring to communities.
Time and time again, we've been promised jobs, but often we get the crappy, unclean jobs.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired and seeing our family members die. And we fought for over 12 years to get this EJ, Cumulative Impacts Law, passed because we wanted to see change.
Here's how the law is supposed to work. The state mapped out overburdened communities, places with a largely low-income, minority, or non-English-speaking population. The new law will require the state to consider how many polluters are already in these places before a new one can move in.
This gives the power to the Department of Environmental Protection to be able to look at the context and say, if you're going to increase the burden in the neighborhood, then we're going to deny this permit.
It could also mean big changes for industries that are already in town, like the incinerator, which might have to burn less trash or add new filters to get its permits renewed. Experts say more change is needed to address entrenched inequality.
This law is a good first step on addressing cumulative impacts in New Jersey. We're going to have to complement it with other strategies and laws and regulations.
We see a lot of really slow movement before we see a victory. Environmental justice is economic, it's racial, it's social, it's housing, it's transportation, it's education.
Over 4.5 million Americans live near an orphan oil and gas well, and these are leaking out tons of methane and deadly gases. But one retired oil executive is making it his mission to hunt them down and plug them up. One place that's riddled with these is Oil City, Louisiana, a town which was named after the early 20th century oil boom.
This crew is plugging an old oil well. It no longer has an owner, and it was never properly sealed. So for decades, it's been sitting here, pumping out environmental toxins unchecked. This is what's called an orphan well.
You can actually smell the methane gas.
And some of the stuff it leaks out can poison us.
Benzene or xylene, we know they're carcinogenic.
Across America, there are an estimated 1 million orphan oil and gas wells. That's like having an extra 2.5 million cars on the road every year. Plugging them would stop any leaks and could help in our fight against rising methane levels.
This is some low-hanging fruit. There's no other ways to abate these emissions other than to plug these wells.
But the problem is, we don't always know where they are.
We done pull wells all over. 9 times out of 10, we pulling them in the field, surrounded by cows, horses.
They've been discovered under houses and schools, and even in people's front yards.
This has really been everyone's dirty little secret.
So who's responsible for cleaning up this mess? And who's actually doing it?
Nowadays, when companies are done with a well, they're required by law to plug it, essentially fill it with cement before abandoning it. But Americans have been drilling for oil for over 150 years.
Before there were any regulations of any kind.
So many early operators before 1950 would simply fill the holes with sand, cannonballs, or trash.
Throwing down telephone poles, rags, trash, whatever, just to jam it up.
Curtis Shuck is a retired oil exec. For the last 3 years, he's been plugging wells across the country with his nonprofit, the Well Done Foundation. We joined him on a well hunt in Louisiana. Here, he found an orphaned one right next to the bayou. If you didn't know what you were looking for, it'd be easy to miss.
Look at this crazy, beautiful ecosystem that is right next to this, this legacy well here. This water inundates this whole area. This goes underwater. And because the casing integrity has been compromised, it starts to bubble gas up around it.
Today, it's harder for a well to become orphaned, but it still happens, especially when there are downturns in the oil industry. Usually it's because operators have gone bankrupt.
So there's no responsible party left to plug the well.
So they fall to the state. They become a ward of the state.
Similar to an orphaned child. And states often don't have the funds to keep plugging them all.
I just couldn't believe my eyes that, in any universe it would be okay to leave something like that behind, to walk away.
To plug these wells, Curtis hires local guys that work in the oil industry. And they use the same gear to plug wells as they do to drill them.
This truck right here is made for the fixed wells. 9 times out of 10, you're gonna have to have the water truck, the cement truck, and the rig.
His team's plugging 75 wells in Louisiana over the next few years, like this one in Caddo Parish. It's typically a 2-day process, beginning with the tubing that runs the depth of the well.
We're washing the well, and what that means, we got to get all the pipes out. You get everything out the well, and you put cement and water down the well to kind of freeze it up.
This well is about 4,000 feet deep. So Terrence and his crew will spend most of the day pulling out and stacking pipe. Usually the pipes won't go to waste.
Some of them will get sold, if not, they'll get recycled.
The next day the crew returns to plug the well. First, they have to flush down high-pressure water to clean out the hole. Then they add cement.
They stop all the oil and they stop from putting another well there.
We've got cement to the surface. The methane emissions have been stopped.
They cut the well off 3 feet below the surface.
We'll weld a monument cap on the top, and then we'll restore the surface area like we were never even here.
But plugging is expensive.
If you don't have the money to plug it on your own, you better learn to like looking at it.
It can start at $30,000 and go up to as much as $1 million per well, depending on the geology. Landowner Hunter Lawler planned to foot the bill himself until Curtis adopted this well. Well Done pays for its pluggings with donations and carbon credits. Because you really wouldn't want an orphan well anywhere near where you live.
They can contaminate groundwater and leak oil and salt, which create environmental dead zones.
There have been wells that have buildings built around them, and there have been explosions.
The methane wells leak out is not only 84 times more potent than CO2, it's also flammable.
24 people were injured in 1985 when a Ross Dress for Less store blew up in LA. It was sitting on an abandoned well leaking methane. Smaller explosions have also happened in nearby Marina del Rey, Colorado, and Pennsylvania. Wells can also leak out carcinogenic or even deadly gases.
Around 9 million people live within a mile of one of these wells in the US.
A well that's properly plugged will stop leaking methane, except we don't know where to find all these orphan wells, so they could be releasing all this bad stuff and no one would know.
Sometimes all that marks a century-old wellbore is a tiny pipe or well casing, which nature can swallow up over time. To start trying to locate them all, Adam and Mary used state data to develop this map. So far, they've recorded 81,000 documented wells and identified hotspots in the South, Appalachia, and California. But that just scratches the surface.
There's probably hundreds of thousands of undocumented orphan wells that we just don't know where they are. We don't have records.
Curtis and his team have focused on Louisiana since 2021.
This has been a huge part of this economy. Little wells in people's front yards.
He first starts in state databases to get a general location of a well.
Oftentimes the coordinates of a well are not, they're very approximate. It's a ground game. Probably walk about, anywhere from 5 to 10 miles a day.
That's what he calls wildcatting. Then he has to determine if the well is a super emitter, emitting more than 22 pounds of methane an hour. That's the case with one he found in the woods behind someone's house. This well is particularly bad. You can actually hear the methane coming out.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? What it's telling you is that it's over the exposure level.
And on this camera, you can see the methane. But the man living on the property had no idea it was here.
Hi, sir. We're working on this orphan well here. Have you seen this one before?
I didn't know that one was there.
Yeah, here, come and check this one out. Check this out. Can you hear that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Curtis adopted this well and will plug it just like he did with the one up the road. But even after it's been properly closed, there's no guarantee a well will stay that way. Across the country in California, earthquakes can reopen plugged wells.
Wells that are drilled through faults are going to be impossible to permanently seal.
Ira Leifer runs Bubbleology, a company that measures air pollution to hunt down the biggest leaks. He installed a bunch of air monitoring instruments on his truck, Sister 2. It has
a greenhouse gas analyzer, ozone, nitrogen oxides. We have one GPS directly at this point. If you don't know where you are, you really don't know anything. That's both philosophically true as well as scientifically. This gives a picture of the atmosphere above us as we drive.
Ira says his monitors are so sensitive,
we're able to see really small plumes, even miles distant.
as he drives around, he picks up plumes from abandoned wells throughout Southern California, like under homes in fancy La Brea, or here in Kern River.
Right now we're once again in areas of active oil production on all sides. We see elevated methane.
When his instruments pick up a plume, he pulls over and takes an air sample.
When we're ready to collect the sample, we crack this here just a little bit. It's not filling too fast. So today on our pass, we saw 14 ppm methane. That actually is one of the highest values that we've seen on land.
Ira then passes his findings to colleagues at California government agencies. So what is the government doing about it all?
Well, for the most part, it's left to the states to deal with the problem. Most states launched plugging programs in the 80s and 90s and have since sealed thousands of wells. But those programs have barely made a dent. Pennsylvania alone still has an estimated 200,000 unplugged orphan wells.
States were woefully underfunded to address this project.
So in 2021, Senator Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico and Senator Kevin Cramer from North Dakota introduced the ReGrow Act to address this problem on a federal level. It passed with the infrastructure bill signed by President Biden the same year and earmarked $4.7 billion for well pluggings.
You're going to see funding go to the states where we know that there's probably the most orphan oil and gas wells across the country.
The money will also get distributed to the Department of Interior to plug wells on federal lands.
An allocation specific to orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells on tribal communities and pueblos.
Even if it all goes perfectly, though, the act will only address documented wells. And that's less than a fifth of the orphan wells that might be out there.
It's a tiny down payment on bringing our infrastructure to where it should have been 10 years ago.
I'm not saying it's not enough, but it's not enough.
In the last 7 years, hundreds of oil and gas producers have declared bankruptcy. So as these companies struggle, more oil and gas wells will go idle. And as we wean off gas and oil for more renewable energy,
Millions of wells are going to be abandoned in the next couple of years, so this is a serious problem.
one solution is to get the oil and gas industry to front more of the bill,
so that the cost doesn't have to be borne by the taxpayer.
But Ira says we can't put all the blame on drillers.
The reality is, we want to live a life where we don't shiver all winter, to live in a place where we can move around with cars and airplanes. This all requires petroleum.
So while we're still dependent on oil, Curtis and his team will keep plugging away, one well at a time.
We keep getting further and further behind. It's time to stop talking. It's time to roll up our sleeves.
Chernobyl is one of the worst nuclear disasters of all time. With the ongoing war in Ukraine, is the country's nuclear waste at risk of causing another catastrophe?
Since Russian forces invaded in late February, Ukrainian volunteers have mounted a desperate campaign to keep their nuclear materials safe. On March 2nd, civilians blockaded a road leading up to Europe's largest nuclear power plant. A nuclear bomb would be catastrophic. But destabilizing the kind of waste stored at Chernobyl and Ukraine's 4 other nuclear plants could create a widespread environmental disaster. So far, the war hasn't led to it, but there have been several close calls.
What was in Chernobyl, it can be again.
Russian forces fired on buildings holding nuclear fuel and forced plant support staff to work at gunpoint for weeks on end. Ukraine shared a video that they claim shows proof Russians dug trenches in the most contaminated areas surrounding the Chernobyl plant. Soldiers occupied it for a month before handing control back to Ukraine.
Tired and stressed out personnel that are operating those kind of facilities. That's basically what brought us the Chernobyl incident in the first place.
There's more than 250,000 metric tons of radioactive waste all over the world. What happens if one of these places gets hit with a stray missile, or, like in Fukushima, a massive tidal wave? We took a closer look at sites in Ukraine to better understand one of the most dangerous types of worldwide waste. In 1986, 2 explosions rocked the Chernobyl nuclear power plant when workers botched a safety test of a particular turbine. The resulting meltdown released around 400 times more radioactivity than the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and took the power plant offline for good.
You had kind of a nuclear volcano that was erupting and emitting vast quantities of this material into the atmosphere.
That material poisoned 1,000 square miles, probably for thousands of years, and winds spread radioactive ash across Europe. Thousands of farmers had to abandon their crops and cancel the sale of sheep that were exposed to radiation. It created a disaster zone that needs to be carefully and constantly monitored to avoid further contamination, because the reactor is still there. 31 people died in the immediate aftermath, and some studies claim as many as 4,000 will eventually die from exposure to radiation. Decades later, in the most radioactive areas, many animals are still showing the effects.
And we've seen increased rates of cataract in the eyes. We've seen increased rates of tumors on the bodies of birds and rodents.
And to this day, the plant employs thousands of people who risk exposure to radiation so they can monitor and do damage control 24/7. They deal with seasonal wildfires that threaten critical infrastructure and release even more radiation into the atmosphere. The Ukrainian government says its monitoring labs were damaged in the fighting, so fires could burn undetected. On March 27th, one Ukrainian official reported that more than 10,000 hectares were on fire. Wind could carry that radioactive smoke in any direction.
Keep in mind, if Chernobyl gets hit, like the fallout will also hit Russia. So it's not in their interest to get that going. It's not that it's a deliberate attempt to take something out, but it's about someone making a mistake, which could have severe consequences. And that's the biggest risk here.
In 2019, a European initiative called the Chernobyl Shelter Fund completed a giant stainless steel dome to cover the reactor that broke down.
This new cover, which is airtight, essentially, will allow the engineers to get into the old reactor and start dismantling it piece by piece. There's enough fuel still sitting in this old bombed-out shelter that it could generate a nuclear reaction.
If that happens, the old reactor could burn and cause a fire, raising radiation levels around the facility. It wouldn't be quite as bad as the original accident, as the radioactive material has been stabilizing for 35 years. The actual reactor is one thing, but the biggest threat is probably the 5 million pounds of highly radioactive spent fuel rods that need to be kept cool.
The small rectangular building that the old spent fuel stored in these giant swimming pools, that's actually probably the most concerning location on the site in terms of stray missiles.
These structures are designed to withstand a plane crashing into them, but not necessarily missiles.
There's no real way to get rid of the material. It's going to take centuries to millennia to disappear completely, depending on which isotope you're talking about.
Ukraine generates over half of its electricity from 4 nuclear plants. The largest is in Zaporizhia, to the southeast. Crowds of civilians blockaded the road leading up to that plant in March to try to keep it safe. At first, it worked. The local mayor said that afterward Russian soldiers met with plant representatives for negotiations. But then, a couple of days later,
горить найбільша атомна станція Європи. Прямо зараз російські танки розстрілюють атомні блоки. Україна – це 15 атомних блоків. Якщо буде вибух, це кінець всім.
Russian forces attacked the plant in the middle of the night. They even fired heavy weapons in the direction of buildings housing radioactive fuel. Footage from inside the plant allegedly shows workers pleading with them to stop.
It's got 6 reactors, it's got huge amounts of radioactive waste stored in the open air outside. These sites being taken over militarily, it's an extraordinary thing to see, and it's something that the international community doesn't seem particularly well equipped to deal with.
Experts say taking over the plant could be a strategic move.
controlling those kind of power plants also controls power of half of the country. That gives you enormous leverage when you're controlling an area or in case of negotiations.
A week after the invasion started, Russian energy officials claimed control over this second plant. There are at least 440 reactors across the world, and because they need a constant supply of cool water, many of them are located dangerously close to coastal areas. But radioactive waste is everywhere. Globally, there's more than 1,200 times the amount of radioactive waste there is at Chernobyl. While some countries have designated nuclear trash cans like Yucca Mountain in Nevada, these areas usually only store low-level radioactive waste. The abandoned community of Hanford, Washington, is home to 56 million gallons of radioactive waste from a nuclear production site that was decommissioned in 1989. Now, nuclear waste from Hanford is seeping into the water and soil in rural Washington. As far as nuclear accidents go, humanity has been extremely lucky so far. The 2011 explosion in Fukushima, Japan could have been much, much worse.
If the accident had happened at any other time of the year, probably, the radioactivity would have had a much bigger impact on terrestrial systems. It could have been going towards Tokyo.
If the radioactivity had blown inland, it could have forced the evacuation of over 35 million people and rendered some areas uninhabitable for a long time. After the accident, intergovernmental groups like the International Atomic Energy Agency helped with the cleanup, and they do the same in Ukraine if needed. In 2016, 2 years after Russia annexed Crimea, the UN passed a resolution introduced by Ukraine on protecting the environment during armed conflicts. That means the UN and the IAEA would help manage any fallout. In fact, the IAEA is already providing technical support to Ukraine and offered to broker an agreement to maintain nuclear safety during the conflict. But it doesn't look like the Russians will agree. We asked the Russian government for comment, but they did not respond. For now, war drags on. Around a quarter of Ukrainians have fled for their lives. If they return, the question is, what kind of landscape will they come back to?
Around 400,000 people live in and around Al-Bab, Syria, an area filled with makeshift crude oil refineries. Here, plumes of smoke release toxic chemicals that are slowly poisoning the workers, many of whom are just children. And it's often these children who are the only ones small enough to climb into the tanks to clean them.
These rustic oil refineries in Syria are a ticking time bomb. The slightest mistake and they can blow up, killing workers.
فأنت عم تنتحر انتحار بطيء مقابل تعيش أولادك سنتين ثلاثة لحتى رب العالمين يفرجك.
Thousands of these facilities popped up in northern Syria after civil war broke out in 2011. Now, millions of displaced people rely on them for fuel to run their cars, businesses, and homes, including Ahmed Abdullah, who owns some of the refineries.
كفينا نتوفرنا هلا 11 سنة ناس مهجرين. هدفنا الأساسي ينقلع بشار الأسد ونخلص منه ونرجع على بيوتنا.
So, what does it take to filter crude oil at these informal refineries in Syria, where children do a lot of the dirty work? And why is this black gold a blessing and a curse for the people here? Ahmed and his family live in a small village called Tarhin near the city of Al-Bab. It's controlled by opposition forces, and it became a safe haven for many refugees during the war. About 400,000 displaced people live here today.
يعني نحن مناطق محررة وحرب وكذا. بلشت العالم هيك، صرت أشوف العالم واشتغلنا والحمد لله مثل ما بقول بشوية مثابرة وتعب وكذا.
Satellite images of Tarhin from 2011 show orchards. Several years later, the land is black and barren and marked by refineries. Ahmed owns 3 of the roughly 650 facilities in this part of town, and he and his siblings poured their life savings into the business when they started in 2012.
في البداية كان التكرير خطر كبير، وراح في ضحايا كبير، عدد كبير كتير نتيجة الهمجية اللي كانت بالعمل.
The crude oil is refined in these 55-gallon metal drums or burners. Each of these can cost up to $50,000.
هاي حراق هذا المشي نحن ماشيين هلا بين حراقات، مكان صفى ضيق كثير
A coal-powered furnace heats the burners. The crude oil evaporates and flows into pipes. These are submerged in water basins so that the vapors can condense and turn into diesel, kerosene, or gasoline.
هذا هو المازوت على هالشكل هيك بصير ينقط يعني.
The heaviest part of the oil settles at the bottom of the drums. It's highly flammable and needs to be removed before the drum is used again for refining. This is what Ahmed calls briquette, and it's used for cooking and heating. Sometimes it's teenagers who climb into the drums to clean them because they can squeeze through. Ahmed doesn't want them around these dangerous tanks. But he says many war-torn families have no other choice.
مليئة الحراقات بيشتغلوا الطفل اللي عمره 10 سنين و11 سنة أهله ما عندهم مي ونحن ساكنين ناسيين يعني مجبر للعمل بيشتغل بالحراقة.
Even his own 16-year-old son helps clean the drums.
أنصح أي طفل عم بشوفه هناك لا تقرب لهون، ممنوع تقرب لهون، حدك أنت هذا المكان تمشي فيه فقط، ممنوع تجي لهون لأن يكون في خطر.
After a long morning, Ahmed takes a break with his workers. Today, he's having tea with Mahmoud Abu Ibrahim, who nearly died in 2018 when an oil drum exploded.
نتيجة الإصابة حرق 86%.
His eyes were permanently damaged.
بدي عملية حاليا، عملية زراعة قرنية تكلف تقريبا شي $7,500. تعالج سنة ونص سواء بتركيا أو بمشافي هون أو بمشافي خاصة.
Just like Ahmed, Mahmoud is also a refugee. Before the war, he was an electrical engineer.
لكن قيام الثورة وخلانا نبتعد وننطرد من الوظيفة بسبب آرائنا وأفكارنا الثورية مشاركتنا بالثورة.
He's exposed to plumes of smoke that release toxic chemicals, slowly poisoning workers.
أكثر الأمراض المنتشرة عندنا هون حاليا نتيجة العمل هي أمراض صدرية، أمراض الرئة.
The smoke also coats plants and trees, killing them off. And oil spills have contaminated the ground and drinking water.
فمضطرين لهالأمر هذا كرمال معيشة أولادنا عم نضحي بأنفسنا.
These makeshift refineries started showing up between 2011 and 2012, when Syrians led a revolution against President Bashar al-Assad. At the time, Ahmed was a paralegal in his hometown of Al-Safira, which had become a battleground. So in 2012, he fled with his family and eventually settled in Tarheen.
أول ما جينا لهون كانت المنطقة يعني عديمة وميتة كئيبة ما فيها شيء خالص. اضطرينا يعني نأسس عمل هون.
But the worst was yet to come. In 2014, ISIS rose to power and eventually took over the country's official infrastructure, says Wim Zwijnenberg, a researcher who's been following the Syria war.
And ISIS made a lot of money from selling his oil to smugglers. So in order to prevent that, the US-led coalition started bombing some of these locations to target wellheads, pumping stations in order to prevent ISIS from pumping up the oil.
The Syrian Democratic Forces and coalition troops defeated ISIS in 2019. But over the last 12 years, the war has claimed over 300,000 civilian lives. Today, Syria is informally divided into several regions. Assad's forces hold most of it. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces have the oil-rich northeast. And Syrian opposition forces backed by Turkey control other parts of the north, including Al-Bab. So tankers regularly deliver tens of thousands of gallons of crude from the Kurd-controlled areas to Al-Bab, where locals distill it. Thousands of people here work in the industry.
So taking away a livelihood and income for families in this area from this industry wouldn't be beneficial for any post-conflict reconstruction and rehabilitation efforts.
الحراقات يعني تعبنا عليها وحاربنا مشان يضل متوفر ويضل قوت الشعب رخيص ونحاول نرخصه أكثر من هيك ويضل متوفر ما يصير انقطاع.
Ahmed's home just a mile away runs on the same fuel. These generators that pump out well water use diesel.
الفيول والمازوت والبنزين بشكل عام هو عصب الحياة. بدونه ما بنقدر نتحرك، لا بنقدر نحرك سياراتنا ولا بنقدر نحرك أفراننا ولا بنقدر نحرك خضرتنا ولا بنقدر نعيش بدون شيء اسمه مازوت وما عندنا بديل.
But the very thing that fuels life for Ahmed and so many others is destructive in more ways than one. And that's where the white helmets come in. They're a humanitarian group of first responders from all over Syria. Hassan Muhammad is one of about 3,000 volunteers. They were especially active at the height of the war in 2014.
الجوي والقصف البري على هاي المناطق كان يكون في شهداء، يكون في إصابات، ناس عاقين تحت الأنقاض.
They've rushed to the site of at least 550 oil refinery explosions. Hassan says sometimes they're a result of recklessness in the refining process. But other times, the Syrian government has targeted these refineries.
أضرار مادية كبيرة جدا في الحراقات في محطات تكرير الوقود. كان هدفنا الوحيد هو إنه نحن نقلل من الخسائر البشرية.
الخوف الأكبر هو القصف الطيران، يعني هذا عم يجينا مفاجئ ومش كل ضرر وما ضرر على حراقة واحدة وطاقم واحد أو شخص واحد.
Despite the risks, this is a lucrative business in an area with few other opportunities.
يعني نحن كان في عنا عمل برا ولكن نحن نازحين وجينا أسسنا عمل وأسسنا بيوت وأسسنا كذا وما عنا غير الحراقات. وفي عنا كان عامل يشتغل باقي له مادتين بتخرج طب موضوع لأن أنا بعد ما أتخرج بدي أروح أشتغل بمشفى يعطوني راتب 2000 أنا الحراقة أحسن لي.
Altogether, his 3 refineries produce nearly 1,000 barrels of fuel a day.
نحن حاليا هون بالشمال ما عندنا مجال للتخزين نهائيا لأن المنطقة دائما بحاجة مازوت. في سيارات ناس مدنية تاخذه للكازيات ويصير مبيعه للمستهلك.
Ahmed buys the crude for $70 a barrel and sells the refined fuel for $100. He makes enough to comfortably support his family. But even staples like groceries are expensive in the war-torn country. And about 60% of the population is battling food insecurity.
نعاني من جناب مقابل إنه نعيش ماديا ولو بنسبة بسيطة من الرياحة المادية. مشان ما نتم بالتزمين أو نستنى كرتونة المعونة.
In his downtime, Ahmed and his sons tend to his Arabian horses. He owns 12 of them. His favorite one is called Shahab, which means shooting star. He frequently participates in horse racing competitions. The hobby is a remnant of his old life, that he hopes to go back to one day.
ناسين مهجرين تعبانين بيكفيك كلمة مهجر، يكفيك كلمة ناجح. أتمنى يعني نرجع لبيوتنا.
أرجع لبلدي، بتمنى تحرر بلدي. والجراثيم الطارئة على المجتمع هي ترجع كمان لحالها، هي بتروح.